here we go. All right. Hello, Tuesday, Thursday girls. Meet the Monday, Wednesday, Friday girls. All right. Hold on. Let me make sure this is picking us up here. Hello, hello, hello. Yep. We should be good. Okay, we're going to be talking about focusing questions now. And this is not super complicated, but I want you to think back to when we talked about the taglines to a movie or the slogans for businesses. We talked about why those are really important. They're helpful, right? They create some curiosity, they stick with you, all those kinds of things. Well, in the same way, a good movie is going to have some kind of suspense or question, something that has to be resolved, right? Every good story does. So books as well, obviously. Books, movies, you've got to have some kind of problem that needs to be figured out. Otherwise, it's just not really all that interesting. And the same thing is true with a sermon. And so that's what your focusing question does. It creates that moment that needs to be resolved, that question that needs an answer. Okay? So what is the focusing question? Just a few points here. The focusing question is a question that will determine how the sermon will develop. It determines how the sermon will develop. The focusing question, now this next statement is going to be confusing. Okay, I'm just going to say that now. The next statement is going to be weird until next week when we talk about structure, and it'll start to make a little bit more sense. But the focusing question can either determine the dominant thought, or the dominant thought can answer the focusing question. The two work hand in hand. I know. It's like a Yoda-ism almost. Like, okay. Yes, the focusing question can either determine the dominant thought or the dominant thought can answer the focusing question. Either way, the two are going to work hand in hand. The question comes in your structure, and what do you want to do? You're always going to ask your focusing question up top. Your focusing question is going to be typically as you transition from your introduction into the body of your sermon. But it's going to be somewhere in the intro, your focusing question. The question is, structure-wise, do you want to then answer that focusing question right away with your dominant thought and make your dominant thought stand in complete answer to that? And then work through, okay, so but how did I get that answer as you work through the points of your sermon? Or do you want to ask your focusing question and then make each of your points stand in answer to that question and then put your dominant thought at the very end of your sermon as in, so here's what we've learned. Okay? So again, this will be a little bit more clear next week when we talk about the different kinds of ways that we can structure sermons. But just know the dominant thought and the focusing question are going to work hand in hand, but there's two different ways that it can do that. Okay? And then your third point there's three types of focusing questions, and this is the most important part for you guys to understand. There are questions of, let me give you all three and then I'll go back and give you some examples. There are questions of explanation. And a focusing question of explanation is essentially asking, what does this mean? And then there's questions of conviction. And a conviction question is essentially asking, is it true? And then finally, there's questions of application, which is asking, what difference does this make? Okay, so let me give you some real-time examples to kind of clarify the difference between these. So with explanation, I might be presenting in my sermon that there's a little bit of a conflict when it comes to faith and good works. So I might say, Ephesians 2 says that we are saved by grace through faith, not works. Okay, and I could preach a whole sermon on Ephesians chapter 2 and how we are saved purely by the grace of Christ. And it has nothing to do with what we do, not our works. We cannot earn it. This is not about merit. This is all about what He's done. We just get the good gift. But then there's also James chapter 2, which says that faith without works is dead. So it seems like they stand in opposition, right? So if I bring both of these into the same sermon as I'm trying to explain faith and works, maybe my focusing question of explanation would be, how can our faith flourish in both grace and good deeds? Okay? We know that the Bible doesn't contradict itself, so I want to understand what do these two passages mean and how can they possibly be pointing to the same thing. So that would be my question of explanation. I'm just trying to understand what these passages are talking about. How can our faith flourish in both grace and good deeds? Now, what about conviction? I might say, let's say I'm preaching on the Great Commission. Or not the Great Commission. Nope, strike that. I'm preaching on the greatest commandment. That's what I meant. You know, there's so many great things in the Bible. We're going to go with the greatest commandment. So I might say to you, church, what is the greatest commandment? Love. Yeah, let's pretend we're like in a Black Baptist church. All right, you talk back. Okay. Yes. Love the Lord your God, right? That's the greatest commandment. What is the second greatest commandment?
Love your neighbor.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Do you believe that, church? Yes. Do you believe that this morning?
Yes.
Yes? Oh, you do. You do. Okay, that's good. Then why in the world are we not loving our neighbor? Oh, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to love our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? And are we loving them well? So questions of conviction. You know, these are things that we think we understand. We would say that they're true, but are we actually living out the very things that we believe? We would say these are at the center of who we are. So who is our neighbor and how should we love them well? Those are conviction questions. I believe it, but am I actually living it out? Okay. And then application, it's a little bit different than conviction. The conviction part is almost in a question where most of the time we would just kind of assume that we're doing those things, but we're actually not. Application is more like, how do we live this out? Okay, so what difference does it make? Let's talk about money. Matthew chapter 19, Jesus talks about money, and he talks about how money is the root of a lot of destruction in our lives. And I might point out to you that money is actually talked about 70 times in the New Testament, so it's a big deal. It's talked about more than most things that we would assume Jesus would talk about a lot. But it's talked about 70 times in the New Testament. So, an application question might be, what do we need to consider when evaluating our relationship with money? What kinds of things do we need to consider when evaluating our relationship with money? So I'm not necessarily explaining something straight out of the text. And I'm not necessarily trying to convict anyone of something that they already know, they're just not doing it. But I am trying to say, okay, clearly money was important to Jesus, so it should also be important to us. So what are some things that we need to maybe do differently than what we've been doing? Okay? So those are three types of focusing question: explanation, conviction, application. Here's the thing about focusing questions. In just about every passage that you exegete, every sermon that you write, you could go any one of these three directions. It really depends upon you and your audience, okay? So this is where you get to say, this is what the text says, but how do I want to kind of resolve this in their life? If it's a more doctrinal type of passage, if it's like understanding the incarnation or the Holy Spirit, then you're probably going to want to go more explanation. If it's a little bit more of a hands and feet type of passage, then you might want to go application. If it's a passage that we as the modern church try to ignore, pretend doesn't exist, then you might want to go conviction. So think about what your audience can really resonate with, and then craft your focusing question that way. Now on your worksheet for Philippians chapter 2, I do ask you to write a question in each of these three types, just so that I can see you understand the difference between the questions, but then you can pick which one you want to roll with. Okay? All right, so same way with the DT, there was a checklist to make sure that your DT is complete and contemporary and all those things. There's also a checklist for a good focusing question. So let's walk through these real quickly. First of all, it must create tension. What good is posing a question that nobody really cares about the answer to, right? So it needs to create some kind of attention, something that people actually want to know the answer to. When I think about, a good book and that tension moment, I think about Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. He's heard about Sirius Black, and everything that's been told to him about Sirius Black is that he's evil and that he's this convicted felon, right? But we all know the truth. He's actually Harry's godfather, but will Harry find out before it's too late, right? That's tension. Maybe your focusing question won't be quite that dramatic, but that's the tension you're looking for. You want a question that people actually I need to know. I want the answer, right? Okay, number 2, it needs to be relevant. It needs to be relevant. Consider your audience. Again, consider your audience with the type of question, but also what your question actually is. Like if you're talking about money with adults, there are a lot of different things you might talk about. Budgeting, tithing, those sorts of things. If you're talking about money to your youth group, it may look a little bit different. So you have to think about who it is that you're talking about, or who you're talking to. If you're talking about family dynamics and principles that are spoken about in Scripture about family and how family should operate, you're probably going to start with marriage with adults. You're probably going to start with obeying your parents if you're talking to students. So your question needs to be relevant to the person that you're posing it to. So think about that. Third, it must be answerable. It must be answerable. You're not always going to have all the answers. I'm guessing that in Principles of Discipleship and Evangelism, you probably talk about if you're having one-on-one conversations with somebody, you're trying to share the gospel with somebody, and they start asking you hard questions and you don't really have the answer. It's okay to say in that one-on-one conversation, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but I can find out. Let's meet again, and then we can talk more. That's perfectly okay. When you're preaching a sermon, however, you can't do that. You can't pose a question in a sermon and actually come to the conclusion that you don't know and then dismiss them and say, I'll work on this some more and I'll come back and resolve this later. Because the problem is there's no guarantee that you're going to get all of those exact same people back in the room again. So what you've done for some of them is just say, there are no answers, we'll never know the truth, and that leaves people in a bit of a lurch, spiritually speaking. So whatever question we pose, we want to make sure that we can answer. Let me say this though. Your answer may not be a complete answer, and that's okay, as long as it's an adequate answer. I mean, think about if you are preaching a sermon on heaven, there are so many things we don't know, and that's okay. There are some we do, and that is enough. You know what I mean? So your answer should be adequate. It doesn't have to be complete, but you do need to have an answer. Okay, next one should be textual. Again, not a question that's just created out of the air, or not a question that you've formulated because, well, this is what my people need to know. Whether Scripture tells it or not, this is what they need to know, so I'm going to come up with an answer for them in this season. No. Your question should be gleaned from the passage. In the same way that your dominant thought should not stray far from the text, your focusing question should be gleaned from the passage as well. The next one is it should be restated. I didn't actually hit on this hard enough with the dominant thought, so let me say this now. Your dominant thought should be repeated. I think a good practice is 2 to 3 times. I think sometimes people can overkill and they repeat it like every transition they use it, which actually, I mean, it can have a little bit of a poetic frame if you do that, if you do it well. But definitely the DT should be repeated 2 to 3 times within your sermon so that people have the opportunity to lock it in. And in the same way, I would say if you can repeat your focusing question twice, that's helpful. So you're going to first ask the question somewhere in your introduction, again, typically in that transition from the intro to the body. But as you come to the conclusion, somewhere near the end, you might want to ask it again, just to remind people of the journey that we've been on for the last 20-25 minutes and how we have actually discovered an answer from the text. And so it's good to just kind of restate it, repeat the question so that everybody remembers what it is that we were searching for in the first place. And then finally, your question should always be open-ended. Open-ended. It needs to be a question that is not answerable with a yes or a no, but there needs to be a little bit more thought behind it. So think about like when you're in youth group and you do the like team building exercises. You know, have any of you guys ever done that before? Like ropes course challenges or anything like that? Okay, so then you come together afterward and you always have to debrief, right? You got to talk about your experience. If you've ever had someone leading the debriefing part that didn't really know how to do it very well, then it gets really awkward really fast because the person will ask questions like, so was that enjoyable, guys? Mm-hmm. Okay, did you find that was like difficult at times? Yeah. Yeah. So, do you feel like this is going to help your team dynamic? Mm-hmm. Okay, you know, I mean, they're trying to spark a discussion. The problem is that they are asking close-ended questions. They're asking questions that can be answered with a yes or a no. Instead, they should have been saying, tell me about what was challenging for you in that particular activity. Okay, let's talk about how this is going to help your team in the future. What do you foresee happening and how could this play out? What did you find fun or exciting? What did you find hard? Those kinds of things. So you can see how that would be the same thing in your sermon. You don't want to ask a focusing question that's a simple yes or no answer. You want to ask a question that's open to some interpretation and some study and some development of that answer. Make sense? Okay. So that's all I got for you. Your worksheet due next week then is for you to figure out your dominant thought. You're going to walk through all the steps for your dominant thought for your Philippians 2, and then to formulate 3 different focusing questions, 1 of each type. And that's it. If you've got any questions, feel free to email me. I'm at Superstart for a couple of days, but I'll try to check emails in between the chaos of managing a lot of middle schoolers. Good fun? It's going to be great. And I'm sleeping on a gym floor tonight. So stoked about that. Nope. Yep. So if you've got it in Tulsa. Okay. Yep. If you've got questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great weekend. And I'll see you Monday, Tuesday.
It's a good thing you got that extra rest these past